We are embarking on a fairly messy Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius from November 25th until December 15th. In honor of this Mercury retrograde, I am coming to you in the only thing that feels comfortable to me right now, which is sleepy clothes, hair up, and no makeup. That's the vibe this Mercury retrograde. We all know what the general vibe of Mercury retrograde is, but I always like to bring attention to the fact that most of the Mercury retrograde problems, they're more so problems with the system that we live in that does not allow for downtime or pauses or errors or just general messiness or humanness, frankly. We're all expected to simply be machines who are endlessly plodding along at the pace of the capitalistic drum. And Mercury retrograde doesn't give a fuck about that kind of thing at all. Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius knows or is learning that rushing ahead can be exciting for a little while, but most of the time the flame just fizzles out and we're left wandering in the dark. It's like trying to start a fire in a snowstorm by burning little bits of newspaper. If you don't have any solid wood set up there, the fire will never stay lit and you will never get warm. So take your time, lay the groundwork first, plan, and remember that a fire requires fuel. This is a messy one because, first of all, Mercury is in detriment in Sagittarius. Mercury doesn't do very well in Sagittarius, or at least it shows up in ways that are strange and unexpected. They are not the normal ways that Mercury shows up. Sagittarius is very big picture oriented and philosophical and exploring your own interpretations of things. Mercury is more detail oriented and fact oriented and research oriented, and it's very specific. They just don't vibe. They don't work very well together. However, at its best, this time period with Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius can bring us back to the big picture. And as it kind of turns the volume down on blind faith and optimism, we have the opportunity to remember what real hope feels like and how real hope is rooted in tangible actions, in tangible reality. Not just a wish that you blow out into the sky, but the hope of taking action and moving forward. In order to take the correct actions, we sometimes have to go back and go over all the details, which is the primary function of this particular Mercury retrograde. We are going back over details and looking at if you can imagine in that Sagittarian way, something beautiful out on the horizon, that's where I want to be. Okay, what are the steps to get there? What are the roads you can take? What are all the different routes? Do you have a car? Do you have money for gas? Do you have money for a bus? Are you going to walk? Are you physically able to walk that far? What is the story? How are you getting there? And this feels like a very unpleasant reality check, which is probably what I'd say is the number one theme of this Mercury retrograde. Realism wins over optimism. But that doesn't mean that situations are actually as hopeless as they feel. But we do have to question the route that we're taking and find the actual steps. This is also really beautifully in line with Saturn in Pisces, and Mercury will square Saturn in Pisces while it's retrograde. That really strongly emphasizes some of those Saturn and Pisces themes around what are the ways to take the things you can dream of and imagine and bring them into actual tangible reality. During this time, we are also questioning our beliefs. We are dealing with consequences of acting or speaking before we've really thought it through. The foot in the mouth syndrome that Mercury in Sagittarius is really known for. And there's likely to be a feeling of sorrow or just sadness over the hopelessness of the big picture. And by the big picture, I mean both the world at large and in your own individual life. Here are some of the themes that this Mercury retrograde may highlight for your rising sign. If you are a Sagittarius rising, this will be in your first house. Therefore, it encompasses themes like body, identity, and sense of self. If you are a Capricorn rising, this falls in your 12th house, which is the house of rest, healing, the subconscious, mental health, peace, and sabotage. If you are an Aquarius rising, this falls in your 11th house, the house of ideals, ambitions, goals, friends, and community. If you're a Pisces rising, this falls in your 10th house. Public life, career, long unmet needs, those are some 10th house things. If you are an Aries rising, this falls in your 9th house, the house of meaning, travel, education, spirituality, growth, and discomfort. I really kind of hate the term higher education, but it's typically education beyond grade school. If you're a Taurus rising, this falls in your 8th house, which encompasses themes like the deep psyche, intimacy, secrets, letting go, loss, money and debt, and kind of just things that are unavoidable, but you'd like to avoid them if possible. If you are a Gemini rising, this falls in your 7th house, the house of relationships, partnerships, projections, and shadow work. If you're a Cancer rising, it falls in your 6th house, the house of health, habits, day-to-day activity, and routines. If you are a Leo rising, this falls in your 5th house, the house of lovers, sexuality, pleasure, creative projects, and children. If you're a Virgo rising, this falls in your 4th house, the house of home, family, ancestry, and childhood. If you are a Libra rising, this falls in your 3rd house, the house of close friends, siblings, comfort zone, mental health, and communication, and kind of just your personal perspective. And if you're a Scorpio rising, this falls in your 2nd house, the house of security, money and finances, intake, problem solving. Those are some of the themes that you'll likely be looking at during this Mercury retrograde. Read that only for your rising sign. Whenever I talk about Sagittarius, I want to mention a few different tarot cards. Obviously, we have the obvious, Temperance, the card that is associated with Sagittarius. I always think of this more as, and kind of a lot of the major arcana cards, as this is a bit of advice for the sign. And this is a really good one for this Mercury retrograde in particular. Not overindulging. We're not going totally over the top. Like Sagittarius likes to go over the top with things. But this is Mercury retrograde, square Saturn. It's ruled by Jupiter and Gemini. Like, it is not as big and celebratory as a normal Sagittarius transit. The Temperance card talks about the balance and moderation and giving a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I think that's an obvious one. This is kind of a hot take, but I always associate the 5 of Pentacles with Jupiter on a bad day. Obviously this is nothing I've ever heard anyone else say, but this is something that always strikes me as Jupiter. It's like you were out with a Sagittarius and you're having a great time and you're like 5 drinks in and they're like, oh, let's do blah, blah, blah. Let's take a trip to the other side of the world, just to use the stereotype. And it all seems really great. And the next thing you know, you're got a broken leg, you're walking through the snow, completely lost, no idea where you're going, and you've lost the Jupiterian light as the intoxication wore off. You may be walking by some hope, but you can't even see it because you're in the fucking dark, because you didn't bring a flashlight, you didn't bring a phone, you didn't have travel plans, you didn't have the money, you didn't have anything in place, you just went. And that's kind of the thing about Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. It's feeling like the build a fire. You know, like build the fire before you go. Schedule the trip before you just go to the airport. Get ready for something. And this really speaks to the larger overarching story of Saturn and Pisces too. It's like you can see that beautiful glistening thing on the horizon, right? But it's so fucking far away, and there's like miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of treacherous landscape between where you are and that point on the horizon that you want to get to. Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius and Saturn in Pisces are kind of about planning it out, figuring out what the actual steps are to get where you want to go so you don't end up like this. Yes, there's always hope, but they don't see it because they're in the fucking dark. Now, whenever there is a challenging transit or something that's potential to be challenging coming up, there are things you can do to give that transit a positive way to show up so that it doesn't like feel a need to show up in the more negative ways. So there are some practical things you can do to make Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius show up a little bit better. Some very simple and practical remediation techniques. One, gentle, and I mean gentle. Remember, Mercury is retrograde. Errors are likely. Be careful. Gentle hip opening stretches. Sagittarius is associated with the hips and the thighs, and it's often said that old emotions can kind of get stuck in your hips. So to like release something that is stuck in your hips like that, or even just in a very simple baseline way, activate the hips in one way or another, that may be a good idea for Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. We can also look through or even reorganize photos from, or like souvenirs or whatever from a trip that you took. Very Sagittarius, going back over something, doing the Mercury of reorganizing, literally perfect. Maybe read old books or notes from college specifically, that's very Sagittarian. Or go into your to be read stack and especially hit any of those spiritual or philosophical books that are sitting in there. Or reach out to a long distance friend who you just haven't talked to in a while. Ideally not somebody that you had any kind of a major falling out with, just a somebody you kind of drifted away from but would like to reconnect with. And reading from Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs, you could try to combine Mercury and Jupiter in harmonious ways to try to get them to work together a little bit better than Mercury naturally works with Sagittarius. So Mercury is associated with almond. That could be combined really beautifully with fig, a Jupiter plant. Or Mercury is associated with pomegranate, which is really interesting. That's a really interesting association. And Jupiter is associated with chestnut. Those might go really nicely together, honestly. Or sage is associated with Jupiter, and marjoram is associated with Mercury. Just ways to combine these two things to get these two to feel a little bit more harmonious together, like eating these things together, making teas. Obviously, I'm not a doctor and will not in any circumstance take responsibility for your health. So make your own decisions and make sure that things are safe before you try them. All in all, this Mercury retrograde is a time to actually build a fire. Figuratively, probably not literally, as we're going through a fucking drought. Like, idealism and high hopes aren't naive, but they need to have substantive fuel, or you're left just kind of wandering in the dark. And Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius kind of says, hey, you're wandering in the fucking dark. What's the right way to go? Or you're running forward. Like, I always associate Sagittarius with a wildfire. It's like you're always running forward. Where are you even going? Do you even have the things you need? Are you nourished enough for this journey? Like, these are the things that we're considering while Mercury is retrograde in Sagittarius. Hopefully this is helpful practically and emotionally. If you found this helpful, obviously, I'm going to say the thing that everybody says for no reason, but I have heard that it's actually helpful. Give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I also have accounts on all the other platforms, and I have a Substack called The Nest, where at $10 a month you can get monthly forecasts and horoscopes, as well as weekly forecasts, if that's your kind of thing. And otherwise, I will see you in the next one, I guess, or I will pretend to see you while I make a video alone in my bedroom.